And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. There are rooms where everyone laughs, and one among them who does not exist. Not visibly, the gestures still happen, the drink is raised, the story lands where it should, but the presence is spectral, hollowed, borrowed from somewhere else. This is not absence. It is performance without residence, a kind of rehearsed echo learned long ago when being seen felt safer than being known. Laughter in this register is not joy but choreography, a social reflex curled around an old wound. Middle age does not create this awareness, it clears space for it. When the music softens and the crowd thins, what remains is not failure but revelation, that the life of the party was a role and the party was a form of hiding. To understand the cost of this long performance is to feel it recoil through the body, not as memory but as velocity. The brain, no longer tethered to the external rhythm of social demand, spins inward. Thought becomes movement without destination. Diagnosis, when it comes, does not heal, it renames. The old ache to be liked, to be safe, to belong is translated into clinical grammar, trauma response, people-pleasing, ADHD. But language does not end the spin. It simply places a label on the wheel, as if naming motion could ever stop it. The contradiction deepens. To know oneself better is not to suffer less, only to watch the suffering with sharper clarity. What had once felt like connection now flickers with suspicion. Every anecdote replayed becomes evidence of erasure. Where was I when they loved me? Was I there at all? Or just a mirror tilted politely to reflect what each person needed? The joke that landed so well last summer now echoes with exhaustion. It is not that the performance failed. It succeeded too well. It erased its source. To be loved for a role is to be unknown in plain sight. This is the loneliness that does not announce itself. It wears a grin, it hugs back, it stays late, and then something fractures. Not loudly, a breath caught mid-laugh, a sentence started and abandoned, its ending forgotten or refused. The silence that follows is not absence. It is what happens when a voice declines to perform its own echo, when the mask slips not in defiance but in fatigue. The room does not notice, but the self does. It registers the break like a dropped stitch, small, uneven, irreversible, and in that missed loop, something unnames itself. There is a moment, quiet, barely visible, when the body realizes it no longer belongs to the choreography. The gestures still occur, but they feel inherited, like echoes of someone else's muscle memory. This is not detachment, not yet. It is something more precise. The awareness that participation has become mimicry. The social self, once fluid and improvisational, now arrives late to its own reactions, lagging behind the timing of laughter, empathy, interest. The space between stimulus and response widens into an unspoken question. Who is animating this performance now? The diagnosis offers clarity, but only by reframing the chaos into pattern. Attention splinters not because the world is too loud, but because it was always required to be filtered, translated, reshaped for safety. People-pleasing, long considered a virtue in disguise, is revealed as a contract, connection in exchange for invisibility. The trauma response is not the wound, but the architecture built around it. And even that architecture begins to decay when its purpose dissolves. What remains is not freedom. What remains is a kind of exposed scaffolding, trembling under its own irrelevance. To become visible only through utility is a quiet violence. The self becomes a tool for others' comfort, calibrated to anticipate, deflect, absorb. This is where the cruelty of optimism lives. In the hope that performance might someday produce belonging, that being endlessly adaptive could finally yield a shape recognized as self. But recognition is a rigged game. It is not given. It is purchased through erasure. The more perfectly one plays the part, the less there is left to witness. In this logic, coherence becomes the enemy. Wholeness threatens the mask. To be known would collapse the system. And then a glitch, a pause held too long, a line misdelivered. A glance that doesn't follow the script. It arrives like static through a clean broadcast. Not loud, but dissonant. The body does not cover it. It lets the error ring. Not for effect, not as rebellion, but as refusal. Merleau-Ponty would say the body perceives even its own disobedience. Here, the perception is not thought, it is friction. It is the ache that reminds you the choreography is ending, that you are no longer translating. You are simply present, misshaped and unsynchronized and somehow more legible than before. Some days the silence feels like surveillance, not imposed but ambient, a kind of attentiveness that demands nothing and explains even less. It is in this atmosphere that internal motion sharpens, not toward clarity but toward contrast. The absence of demands reveals the shape of all prior compulsions. When no one is watching, the performance persists. This is the most unnerving realization, that the social self does not dissolve in solitude. It lingers. It performs for an imagined witness, an internalized crowd still hungry for coherence, charm, and seamless affect. Even the inner life has been colonized by applause. But what if the crowd was never real? Or worse, what if it was once real and is now internal, preserved not in memory but in the very architecture of attention? The desire to be legible, to be anticipated and received, folds into the nervous system like code into circuitry. There are moments when a sentence forms in the mind, not because it wants to be spoken, but because it would land well. Not because it is true, but because it would make someone else feel comfortable. This is not empathy. It is training. The reflex to please has become indistinguishable from the impulse to speak, and still, within this recursion, something quieter insists. A signal beneath the noise. It does not arrive as a revelation, but as friction, the way a wrong note lingers longer than the melody. The friction is the first honesty. It marks the place where performance begins to fail, where the script starts slipping off the tongue. The self, though still practiced, becomes porous. What slips through is not a new identity, but a faint refusal to continue being understandable at the cost of being real. In this refusal, the brain does not calm. It accelerates, it builds complexity not for others, but for itself, as if meaning were no longer currency, but shelter. Butler might say this is the violence of recognition reversing itself, when the subject, once sustained by the gaze, begins to crumble under its own legibility. And yet the crumbling is not collapse, it is architecture in reverse. Not demolition, but the careful dismantling of a house never meant to be inhabited. Every beam removed reveals the sky. Every unlearned gesture leaves room for breath, and within that breath, not peace, not self, but the possibility of something not yet performed. There is no stable ground between performance and withdrawal, only a shifting terrain where the self recalibrates moment by moment, unsure whether to offer a smile or retreat into abstraction. The body moves through the world like a signal, distorted by static, legible but only barely. Social gestures become translations of internal delays. A pause too long, a response half-formed, a glance that misses its cue. These are not failures in etiquette. They are symptoms of an emerging refusal to be edited in real time. The nervous system, once fluent in anticipation, begins to stutter its way toward truth. This truth is not declarative. It does not arrive with clarity or grace. It stumbles out of disorientation, shaped less like an answer and more like a question the self can finally risk asking. Why did coherence matter so much? What contract was made between survival and likability? The mask, once artful, even beloved, begins to fray, not because it was false, but because it was exhaustive. No one can smile without muscle fatigue forever. Eventually, the face forgets which version was real. Eventually, the eyes no longer blink on cue. Diagnosis offers a strange permission. It confirms what was long suspected, that the effort to belong was not neutral, that the spinning was not imagined. ADHD, trauma, the somatic inheritance of vigilance, these are not labels but coordinates. They do not locate the self, they trace its evasions. They map the places where the self performed instead of felt. But even this mapping risks another kind of trap, understanding as containment. To name the spiral is not to exit it. It is only to know its texture, its rhythm, its cost. There is a forest of thought that grows where silence is allowed to stay uncorrected. In that forest, movement changes. It is not the frantic pacing of social rehearsal, nor the frozen stillness of burnout. It is something else, a motion that asks nothing of others, a pattern that does not seek applause. Perhaps this is what Berlant meant when she spoke of attachments that both sustain and stall us. The mask is not torn off in defiance, it is placed down in grief. What follows is not identity, it is environment. The inner world, once calibrated to perform, begins to grow wild again. To untrain the body is not a gesture of will. It is a slow, ambient unravelling, like unlearning a melody played so often it lived in the fingers. The choreography of likability does not vanish overnight. It dissolves through repetition without reward. A joke told to an empty room. A reflexive apology no one required. A story crafted for resonance that never lands. These are not mistakes. They are echoes of a self that once ensured survival by being frictionless. And frictionlessness, over time, becomes erasure. The surface smooths until nothing can catch on it, not even intimacy. The question emerges, if the self has always been adaptive, what does it mean to stop? Stillness is not what follows. What follows is confusion, noise, overactivity. The brain, denied its usual script, produces in excess. Thoughts layered over thoughts, scenarios without prompt, loops that simulate presence without needing the world to respond. Han would recognise this, not as chaos, but as the feedback loop of self as project. When the audience is gone, the internalised critic takes the stage. It does not demand perfection, it demands production, continuity. A self that updates itself hourly, not for improvement, but to remain plausible. This plausibility is violence by another name. It insists that the self cannot simply be. It must narrate, translate, anticipate, even alone, especially alone. The silence of solitude becomes another test. Can you generate meaning in the absence of witnesses? And when meaning fails to coalesce, shame enters, not because one has done wrong, but because one is no longer performable. The shame is architectural. It resides in the structure that made visibility the condition for mattering. But what if the spiral is not failure, but aperture? What if the endless inner motion is not dysfunction, but memory trying to move without instruction? A form of epistemic compost, old logics decaying into possibility. In this model, the spinning brain is not the problem. It is the sign that something ungoverned is awakening, a non-performative self, a version not yet shaped by reception. Lispector knew this when she wrote characters as syntax breaking itself open, not to confuse, but to let the sentence breathe. The self is doing the same now, not explaining, not cohering, just breathing through the static. There is a kind of intelligence that only emerges in disorientation. Not the sharp, articulate clarity prized in conversation, but a slower knowing that resists language. It flickers at the edge of coherence, not because it lacks precision, but because it does not want to be pinned. The brain in its spinning generates not confusion but refusal, to settle, to conclude, to resolve for the sake of being palatable. This is the epistemic drift Butler hints at, where the self no longer stabilizes for recognition but becomes something more unstable and alive, a site of process, not product. In this state, loneliness takes on a different texture. It is no longer the absence of others but the echo of former selves, the party version, the useful version, the version that could enter a room and rearrange its atmosphere to match the longing in others. These selves linger, not out of nostalgia, but out of unfinished contract. They were summoned for survival, and now, without a function, they haunt. But even haunting has rhythm, and that rhythm eventually shifts. The echo fades, not with violence, but with disuse. The script, no longer rehearsed, begins to disintegrate. A new voice tries to form, not louder, but quieter. It does not seek approval, it does not explain, it does not entertain, it waits. This voice does not belong to the old self, nor to the diagnostic labels that mapped its behaviour. It is less voice than vibration, less thought than intuition. It lives in the interval between reaction and decision, in the split second where the self could perform and instead chooses to pause. That pause is radical. It contains all the selves that might have spoken and the silence that refuses them. Fanon wrote of the masks imposed and the masks assumed. This moment is neither. It is not the rejection of performance, nor its embrace. It is its suspension. The self hovers, not blank, not absent, but unscripted. It does not yet know how to live in this mode. There is no grammar for it, no reward system. But in the waiting, there is breath. In the breath, something reorients. Not identity, not narrative, not meaning, just the felt sense of not being watched, and the strange, difficult freedom of not watching oneself in return. Sometimes what looks like stillness is actually a shift in gravity. The effort once expended to remain visible now turns inward, not as collapse, but as redirection. The self does not stop moving, it begins moving differently, not toward applause, but toward a quieter kind of coherence, not the kind that earns belonging, but the kind that no longer demands it. This coherence is not clean, it resists narrative, it fragments under pressure, but in its brokenness, it holds. The inner world, long distorted by the need to be received, begins to register itself without external calibration. This is where forgetting becomes a form of liberation, not memory loss, but memory deprioritized, a refusal to measure the present against the past. The roles once played do not vanish, but they lose their script. There is no longer a need to be the funny one, the stable one, the one who knows what to say. These archetypes collapse not because they are false, but because they are exhausted. There is grief in this, grief for the skill, the fluency, the way the room once responded. But also relief, the kind that arrives only when vigilance ends and nothing immediate replaces it. The diagnosis now sits differently. It is no longer a definition, but a companion, a map of how the nervous system learned to behave under impossible terms. It becomes less about pathology and more about pattern. The spinning does not stop, but it loses its urgency. It no longer seeks exit. It becomes weather, passing, returning, ungoverned, something the self can notice without managing, something it can live with even in its most untranslatable form. This is not healing in any conventional sense. It is not recovery. It is residence. A willingness to remain inside the brain's strange logic without asking it to perform. And in that residence, meaning starts to behave differently. It does not solidify. It circulates. It does not offer answers. It creates space. The self becomes less a site of performance and more a porous threshold between past and present, between coherence and collapse, between the voice that narrates and the silence that watches. This threshold is not a moment, it is a mode, a slow return to the self without spectacle, a shift so subtle it is easy to miss, unless you've lived your life spinning and have only just now begun to feel the ground. Nothing announces itself in the end. There is no decisive break, no final unmasking, no scene where the self steps forward, clean and whole. Instead, there is duration, the quiet continuity of becoming without spectacle. The spinning still happens, but it no longer demands interpretation. It is simply part of the air now, a motion within the motion, no longer signaling crisis, no longer needing to stop. The self that remains is not healed, not resolved, but present in a way that does not collapse under scrutiny. It does not audition. It does not conclude. It lingers. What emerges is not a new identity, but a new relation to identity, a way of holding contradiction without translating it, a fluency in partial truths. The performance does not vanish. It becomes memory, a texture within the voice, a rhythm in the body, a contour in the thoughts that rise and fall without audience. There is no urge to replace it with something purer, no need to make the self coherent again. Instead, there is room for silence, for stuttering, for moments that do not land, for thoughts that do not perform, for being that does not insist. The world continues to reward clarity, certainty, recognizability. It still invites the performance. But now the refusal is gentle, not a protest, not a declaration, just a turning away, a quiet return to the internal interval where meaning is allowed to form without scaffolding. The self waits there, not as content, not as form, but as attention, slow, recursive, alive. And in that waiting, something difficult and essential becomes bearable, not by being explained, not by being named, but simply by being stayed with. There is no lesson, no closure, only the echo of the old life and the shape of the new one that does not yet know its edges. The crowd recedes, not because it was defeated, but because it was absorbed. The need to be seen no longer overrules the desire to remain. The spinning persists, and with it the rhythm of a life no longer asking to be understood, just lived, quietly, relentlessly, on its own terms. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.